Hi grade 2 at Ishmik. My name is Thao and this is my book. On the cover is me. I'm actually a little girl here, although it looks like a boy. And this is a picture of me in Australia, although I wasn't actually born in Australia. So let me take you back and the reasons why I wasn't actually born in Australia. So Vietnam had a civil war, and the war ended on the 30th of April in 1975. It was after the war ended that my mother met my father. And when they got married a few years later in 1978, my older brother was born. But life was very hard, it was actually very dangerous. So my family, my mother and father, needed to leave Vietnam because they felt that they could have better opportunities outside of the country. So we came from a landlocked area, which means that it's not surrounded by any water bodies. And that meant that the only way that we could leave the country was crossing through Cambodia, which was next to Vietnam, and then into Thailand, where we knew there were United Nations refugee camps there. In December 1979, my mother, my father, who was about 26 years old at the time, my older brother, who was only a 12-month-old baby, and two 15-year-old boys, my cousin and my uncle. They all left to go to Thailand. So it was a very, very dangerous journey. On the border between Cambodia and Vietnam, that border was heavily guarded. So they had to be separated. My father went first, then my mother with a little baby in her arms, and he was wrapped up as though he was goods to be sold. So he had to be disguised. And what was really strange was throughout the whole journey, he didn't cry. And that was actually a miracle, because if he did cry, they probably would have been caught and would have been shot. So as they progressed through the jungles of Cambodia, there were many bombs underneath the ground that were planted by a group called the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge was a group within Cambodia that were very violent, and they wanted to take over the country. Compared to all the other countries in the world, there weren't as many mines as compared to Cambodia at that time. So what were the risks for them as they traveled through Cambodia? They could have died from these mines that were unexploded in the ground, and you couldn't see them when you walked. They could have been shot by the Khmer Rouge soldiers. They could have died of thirst because in the jungle there was no fresh water. So it was very, very dangerous, and they got separated. It took them about 1 month to travel through the jungles in disguise, hiding in huts at night. And one particular man who had a hut allowed them to hide. And in the middle of the night, they heard the soldiers surrounding the hut. And if they were going to be inspected, they would have been killed. But that man kept silent. And the little baby, who was 12 months old, my older brother, was actually dying because he had been bitten by a scorpion and there was no fresh water to drink. So they had drunk the muddy water on the ground, and that made him very, very sick. And at that time, there was no fruit. People were starving in Cambodia. But this one old man gave my older brother a little dried mandarin. And the mandarin had a little bit of juice left. So my older brother just chewed on that mandarin, and that could have been the difference between life and death for my brother. So my mother says, you know, this old man, he was a stranger, but he saved our life. And he protected us by not showing the soldiers where we were. Because if he had shown them, he would have been saved, but we would have been killed. So then finally we walk through and we get to a camp in Cambodia. They're all separated, and it was very, very scary for my father because he didn't know what happened to his baby, and he didn't know what happened to his wife or his nephew or, you know, the other relative, which is my uncle. Unfortunately, very sadly, along the way, one of the group was captured, and it was my uncle. And he was 15 years old at the time, and to this day we don't know where he is. But some of my family still live in hope. What happened then was that they ended up being reunited by the Red Cross and the United Nations in a camp in Thailand. The camp was actually a prison for women who were criminals and convicted criminals. But the prison had been turned into a camp to house refugees like us. There wasn't much food, there was no medical facility, and actually along the whole journey my mother was pregnant with me in her tummy. And in the camp she then gave birth to me, and it was underneath a tree, and there was no doctor, but another refugee who was actually a doctor, he was also escaping, he delivered me. And it was very, very hard living there, but we had hope and we survived. So when we were in the camp in Thailand, we put in an application to be accepted as refugees and to settle in Australia. My dad chose Australia because it was not as far from Vietnam as it was America or Canada or France or other countries in the world, because he had hope that one day possibly we could return and come back to Vietnam, his homeland. So Australia accepted us, and we waited in the camp for a few months, but then on November 1980, we boarded a plane to go to Australia and to start our new life. And at that point, my mother still couldn't believe that she would be going to another country to live. And she felt that she was in a daydream. She had never been on a plane before, and when they boarded the plane, it was a Qantas plane, an Australian plane. She was very, very nervous. So at this point, I was a 3-month-old little baby, and I wasn't very well as well. I was quite sick on the plane. And there was my older brother, who was about 18 months or close to 2 years old, and the rest of the family, but missing one, because remember, we lost one along the way. And it's very interesting that before the war ended in South Vietnam, because of the Americans being in Vietnam, you know what they brought with them? They brought Coca-Cola, and they brought different types of American foods. But then after the war ended in 1975, there was no more Coca-Cola, and my mother never saw a Coca-Cola again until she went onto the plane, and then she saw a can of Coca-Cola. And when she saw the can of Coca-Cola, she knew that they were going to go to a different country, and she knew at that point that they were safe. So when we landed in Australia, the weather was very, very different to Vietnam. South Vietnam is a bit hot, it's humid, whereas in Australia it's quite dry. So they were cold, they were very cold, whereas everyone else was not cold at all. And then they were put on a bus, they were welcomed by an Australian person, and they were put on a bus and taken to a type of reception centre, a hostel. So it was a complex, and it was like a big hotel to support the new refugees. And she said she remembered seeing all the houses and how large they were. And at that point it was spring, so lots of flowers were in bloom. And these are the type of flowers she'd never seen growing up in Vietnam. And she was in a completely different world. And she was happy, but she was also very scared. She didn't know the language. My father didn't speak any English, even though he had studied French, but they don't speak French in Australia. So they got to the reception centre, and they were a young family with 2 babies, and they were going to start their new life in Australia. But it wasn't very easy at all, because they didn't know what work they were going to do and how they were going to get money, and they couldn't speak the language. But there were other Vietnamese refugees already at the centre who had families in Sydney. So they were able to share with my parents of the different opportunities they could have in order to set up their life, their new life. So when we arrived in Australia, there were very few services at that time to support us. And my parents weren't given that much English support as well. But what was very important to them was to make money, because they needed to send it back to their relatives in Vietnam who weren't able to leave the country. So what my dad ended up doing was working in a factory. So he operated various machines and he worked in a factory for about 30 years. And meanwhile, my mother, who was a law student in Vietnam, she got work as a sewer. So the clothes that would be sold in supermarkets and malls, she would sew them in a factory. And later on, she brought the work at home to make the clothes at home so that she could look after myself as a baby. So my father in Vietnam, he was actually a banker. So he worked in a bank. But after the war ended and when he got to Australia, because he didn't know the language and he didn't have any Australian education, he couldn't get a job in a bank. So then he had to work in a factory. So life was very, very difficult for them on many different levels. They had left the country that they knew, their family, their friends, their jobs, their opportunities, and they took the risk of going to another place and starting again. And the risk that they faced when they made that decision was, one, they could die. They could have died along the journey. And once they got to Australia, what other risks were there? They actually couldn't even calculate those risks. But what they were facing in Vietnam and the devastation was so much that they still faced the challenge of leaving the country on that terrible journey and taking that risk. So when they got to Australia, they knew that the most important thing for them was to create an opportunity for their children, the opportunity that they couldn't have in Vietnam, which is the reason why they left. So they worked very hard and they put myself and my brothers through school in order for us to get the best opportunities that we could. So a few years after arriving in Australia in 1989, my younger brother was born. So in my family, there are 3 children, and 3 of us are born in 3 different countries: Vietnam, Thailand, me, and Australia for my younger brother. So we have 3 different nationalities in the same family. But the opportunities that we found in Australia were not just given to us, we had to find it ourselves. So it was really important for my parents to always have a sense of hope, because they believed that there was opportunity for us, they believed in hard work, and they believed in being courageous. Because if you didn't have courage, you wouldn't be able to see an opportunity and therefore look at the risks and then take on that opportunity and face those risks in order to get to a better place. So what they did was they worked very hard, and they taught me that together with hard work, honesty, and being able to face challenges with courage, you can actually make a better life for yourself. But it wasn't easy for me too, because even though I grew up in Australia and I spoke English very well, I went to school and I had Australian friends, it was very hard for me to find a sense of belonging, because when I went to school and I turned on the TV or I looked in magazines, I didn't see myself. I didn't see people who looked like me. I didn't see people who ate the same food at home. And so I felt very different, and I didn't feel like I belonged in Australia. And I remember when I was 11 years old and I was in year 5, I was in grade 5, and I went to Vietnam for the first time. And it was my mum's first trip to Vietnam since she left the country in 1979. It was the first time that she saw her own mother again and her own brothers and sisters again. And it was an amazing, amazing trip. And for the first time, when I went to Vietnam, I saw everybody who looked like me. and they ate the same food as I did. They even had the same names as I did. And I thought that I belonged in Vietnam. I thought, no, I'm not from Australia. I don't belong in Australia. And so when I came back to Sydney, I felt my home is in Vietnam because everyone looks like me and they speak the language, the same language, and I feel the same. And what's very interesting is as I grew up and as I tried to find a sense of belonging and a sense of where my home is, it brought me back to Vietnam when I grew up. And I finished university, I became a lawyer, and I got a job with an international company in Vietnam. And I said, this is my chance to really belong. So I went back to Vietnam to try and find that sense of belonging. But you know what happened? I didn't completely find that sense of belonging because I spent so much time in Australia. I had my mum and my dad and my brothers and my best friend in Australia. And then I realized that, you know, belonging isn't just in one place. Belonging, feeling like you belong, can be in many different places. And it doesn't just have to be in Vietnam, and it doesn't just have to be in Australia. And when I grew up living in Vietnam, I realized that where I belong is where I feel loved. And where I feel loved is where there are people who love me. And so now I feel like I belong in many different places. So that's my family's migration story.